Good afternoon. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and we're one of the organizations that are part of Moral Mondays Iowa, and we help to coordinate each of the events each week. I'm really happy that you chose to be part of this in the conversation around the voluntary diversity plans and kind of what's in store in the legislature. We have three really exemplary folks on this issue and that have a lot of knowledge that they can share. If you're new to Moral Mondays, our normal process is to have our speakers talk, and each one of them will have a little bit of time to do that. And then we open it up for questions and answers at that point. So we're very happy to have with us Senator Herman Kornbach, who is from Ames, Margaret Buckton, who is with the Urban Education Network, and then Tom Ahart, who is the superintendent of Des Moines Public Schools. I want to thank all the legislators that are in the room. In particular, we have a number in here, so I won't point them all out, but thank you so much for being here. And then all of you as advocates. So grateful that you're here to learn about this issue and how you can be an advocate on behalf of diversity plans for the districts that are involved. So we're going to start with Margaret Buckton.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to give you a little bit of the history and the big picture, and then we'll get more specific as we move down. The handout that you have in front of you has the 5 districts that have diversity plans in Iowa today. That's the one that has the text at the bottom. And these diversity plans were created in 2008 in response to a Supreme Court decision because all 5 of these districts had desegregation orders. Historically, the Supreme Court ruled that you could not use race as the sole factor in having a diversity plan or a desegregation plan. So these 5 districts changed their plans. They're called voluntary diversity plans. They're typically based on socioeconomic status. So the income of the student as qualified by free and reduced lunch eligibility determines whether or not the student has an opportunity to open and roll out based on who comes in. So the law was written, there is Iowa law that regulates these diversity plans, and open enrollment in these districts exists kind of like a trade. If you have somebody who comes from one income class who wants to leave the district, if they're a higher income student, another higher income student will come in. Low income students are allowed to leave the district. The data when they get into the specifics will tell you that there are not very many low income families that are asking to leave these 5 school districts in particular. There are also other laws that provide exceptions to the open enrollment law. So if a student has a particular health need that's better served in another district, if they have siblings that are already open enrolling to another district, if they have a bullying or harassment need, or based on residential location in another district because they've moved, all of those open enrollments are typically granted by the district without considering the diversity plan. So that's the background. You all have a copy, I hope, of 5 charts. You don't even have to read the charts, but you will see a little yellow tag that tells you which district you have. And many of you have different districts. And I'm just going to do a quick little poll. And in the upper right-hand corner, it is open enrollment out. Those are all negative numbers. So how many of you have a declining trend in that upper left-hand corner on your chart? Every single one of you should, okay? And that's a pretty steep decline. So whether you're talking about Iowa City or Burlington or Marshalltown, these are other districts that don't have diversity plans. So you can see the data. In the upper right-hand chart, this is the poverty rate, the percent of students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. How many of you have an increasing trend line on that, right? So in both cases, you see open enrollment out is negative, poverty is increasing. And then in the middle on the left, you have the number of Hispanic students that are in that district. I think every one of these examples has a pretty steep curve on growth of minority students. The chart in the middle right is our African American students, and it's interesting, there's a dip in many districts where it went down and came back up. If you're looking at either Iowa City or Des Moines data, you saw a big increase in the years where it dipped everywhere else. So I don't know if that speaks to migration or something else, but typically, those 2 things combined, we see more minority students in the districts that are seeing open enrollment out of the district that overpowers open enrollment in. And then on the bottom, you'll see the number of white students in the district, and it's just a number, not a percent. Only in those districts like Iowa City that have increasing enrollment overall do you see an increase in that number, and all of the other examples you have, you likely see a decrease in that number. So part of this conversation, and I'm sure Senator Quirmbach and Superintendent Ahart will get into this, is about preserving the diversity that we have in our school districts without having a concentration of more minority and more poverty that gets at the point where it's really difficult to meet the needs of those students. On the back of that text explanation, you'll see a spreadsheet. And the 3 districts that are on this, well, the 5 on the right-hand side are those with diversity plans. Do you not have that? I will make sure that you get a copy of that in just a second. I think I can refer to it without. So those that are highlighted are Des Moines, Waterloo, and Davenport, and you'll see that percent of open enrollment out, the percent of their total district enrollment that they have. That's relatively stable compared to the others. The others who are seeing the same kind of motion out of the district while you have increasing poverty and minority, they are as high as 16% of the students open enroll out of the district. That's Burlington, the most extreme example on this list. So what we would expect happen without the diversity plans is you will have more higher income individuals leaving these districts, and you will see that bottom number, the percent of students in poverty, as measured by free and reduced price lunch, will go up like the other comparison districts have experienced. So that's a lot of data to throw at you at once, but I think in the context of the policy conversation, your other 2 speakers will give you a little bit more to help process that.
Okay. Well, I guess that makes me next. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation and for everybody coming here. This is a very important issue, and I'm glad to see such a very high level of interest. We're talking about, I think the reason we're here is because of Senate File 270, which is a bill that has passed out of the Education Committee, and I'm sorry, I think it probably has a new number, but the gist of it is that it would end the voluntary diversity plans in the districts that Margaret mentioned. So why is this bill coming forward? Well, I like always to try to give people the benefit of the doubt as far as why they're proposing legislation. The chair of the committee, Senator Sinclair, at the committee meeting that discussed this, the Education Committee meeting, read from a number of emails that she has gotten from people who wanted to open enroll their kids out of a district, I think for the most part Des Moines, and were denied, supposedly because of the voluntary diversity plan. Now, some of those emails sounded pretty sympathetic, sounded like, there might have been basis for making an exception. Any decision process that you have, any decision process, any appeals process is capable of making mistakes. It is possible that some people maybe had good reason to open and enroll their kids out and were denied denied in cases that conceivably should have been approved. The more general argument here is to give parents more choice about where their kids would be educated. Well, I think we need to look at the data, and the data I'm quoting is data Margaret gave me, so my interpretation she's not responsible for, but I want to thank her for generating a lot of the numbers here, and a fair number of the numbers came from Des Moines School Districts as well, so I should probably be giving the data to somebody else to read. Anyway, there were a fair number. There is an appeals process, okay? You go to, if you're denied, you can appeal to the local school board, and if you're denied again, you can go to district court. Well, in Des Moines, these are 2016-17 data. From what I'm told here, there were 92 appeals and 55 were granted. So there is an appeals process that is functioning that does allow a certain number of people out who otherwise might have been denied on the basis of the diversity plan, but where there are compelling reasons to grant an exception. As far as the choice argument is concerned, there's also a whole lot of choice. And one of the avenues of choice is to reassign the student within the district, rather than open enrolling to a different district, to reassign within the district. So again, the same school year, there were 1,059 requests for transfer within the district, and 505 of those were granted. So there seems to be a lot of choice, and it doesn't seem to be too terribly hard to access that. Compared to the 1,059 requests for within-district transfer, there were only 257 requests for open enrollment out. So a lot more people are using the avenue of transfer within the district than trying to get their kids out. Of the 257, 75 were granted. So open enrollment out, I mean, there is some limit on that. I believe that overall in Des Moines, again, same school year, 2016-17, there were a total of 1,467 students who were open enrolling out. That's cumulative, all right? The 257 were new applications, but kids who had been granted applications before to open enroll out were continuing to open enroll out, 1,467. So there seems to be a fair amount of choice available both within the district and outside the district. Well, okay, so I'm not finding the arguments in favor of this bill especially compelling. I do think they need to be considered. But I think that we also need to look at the effect of this bill. All right, intent is one thing, effect is something else. I'm an economics professor. I teach my students all the time about looking for unintended consequences, because often they are very significant no matter how well-intentioned a proposed policy is. The most persuasive data I have here actually came from an Interfaith Alliance luncheon over in Cedar Rapids back in December. Presenting that day was Brad Buck, who is the superintendent in Cedar Rapids, who very recently served as Governor Branstad's director of the Department of Education. The data that he presented were quite interesting because it really provides a sort of a controlled experiment. Cedar Rapids doesn't have a voluntary diversity plan, okay? They have open enrollment, and pretty much if the receiving district is willing to take the kids, then the kids get out, all right? Well, the data that they provided, and again, 16-17 school year, the percentage of students within the district who are white, who are categorized as white, 67%. The percentage that open enrolled out, the percentage of those who open enrolled out who were white, 78%. So a significantly higher percentage of those open enrolling out were majority population than you would expect had the open enrollments simply been randomly distributed among racial groups. Even more striking is the free and reduced lunch. That's the way we measure low income, all right? The district is about 50-50 as far as free and reduced lunch and full price. Of the 50.6% who had who paid full price for lunch, that's the general population. Of those who open enrolled out, 90.6%. All right? It's 50-50 between free and reduced and full pay. Of those open enrolling out, 90%, better than 90%, are full pay. Only 9.4% are free and reduced. So what you see from Cedar Rapids is that open enrollment, whatever the intention of the parents involved, and I'm not denigrating anybody's intentions, but the effect is that well-to-do white families are taking their kids out of the Cedar Rapids district. okay? That's what happens, in a control group kind of experiment if you don't have limits. Now, what's the overall effect of that? Well, a book that I have been promoting to as many people who are willing to listen to me, and a few actually have listened, there's a book called Our Kids, written by Robert Putnam, who is a sociologist who wrote Bowling Alone. The subtitle of the book is, I believe, The Crisis in the American Dream. And in great detail, some of it, a lot of it very readable anecdotal stuff. There is some statistics in there. It indicates how we are becoming a more and more and more divided society, divided by race. It's America. Race always matters, but divided also by income, by class, and by education. And I think that abandoning the diversity plans, it would only serve to accelerate this already growing problem. So what should we be doing? Well, I go back to that handful of emails about people who have asked for open enrollment and been denied, and a few plausible cases where maybe exceptions should have been granted. The appeals process, as I indicated, goes through the local school board. Well, again, not to question anybody's motives, but the local school district does have something of a financial incentive to retain students. If a kid open enrolls out, they take the state support with them. So that costs them some money. Now, I'm not saying that dominates the process, but it may influence the process. So one way to deal with those cases, a much more modest solution, would be to revise the appeal process. And Senator Bowman, my colleague, who is a high school teacher himself, still teaching in high school when he's not down here, he has proposed that we create a different appeals process, one that involves decision makers outside the school district, and there are several different ways that we could go about that. I don't want to get you too far into the weeds on that. But if we create a different appeals process that is independent of the financial interests of the school district involved, I think that would be a reasonable solution to what is portrayed as the motivating problem here. Okay? The thing that's in the back of my mind, I keep coming back to, is 1868. It was 150 years ago. The Supreme Court of the State of Iowa, Senator Bolton tells me it was the Clark decision. He's the lawyer. I'll take his word for it. 150 years ago, the Supreme Court of the State of Iowa said that desegregation was a violation of equal protection under the law, equal opportunity. So 150 years ago, Iowa abandoned segregated schools. That was 86 years before Brown versus Board. This state was 86 years ahead of the rest of the country. Now is not the right time to go back.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, thank you all for your interest in this issue, and from my perspective, of course, I have a different bias than Margaret or Senator Cornbach, but one that really is focused on the best interests of some of our most disadvantaged students in the state. In Des Moines Public Schools, we serve just over 33,000 students, and among that group of students, there are represented 112 different countries of birth, and depending on how you count distinct dialects, approximately 200 different languages spoken. The poverty rate, as measured by free and reduced priced lunch qualifying students, is 75%. Our white population, those students who self-identify as white or Caucasian, is just shy of 40%. I want to emphasize that in the open enrollment process, under the diversity plan, students open enroll out and students open enroll in every year in Des Moines Public Schools. So it is not, as some have suggested, a blanket no to anyone seeking to leave the district. We do have a robust review process for any appeals, and to Senator Cornbach's point. I'm not saying that we get it 100% right 100% of the time, but I think we're pretty darn close. And we certainly take those appeals very seriously and look at them with great detail. There are a lot of educational correlates to poverty. Students who come from disadvantaged homes enter school typically with a fraction of the vocabulary that their non-poverty peers bring into the school experience. That's one of the most telling factors, but there are a whole host of others. When you concentrate the level of poverty within a school or within a school district, correcting for those disadvantages becomes exponentially more difficult. When you add on the number of foreign languages or world languages that are non-native English speakers, another way to say it, bring to that educational equation, it again magnifies that lift that our teachers and our building administrators have on a day-by-day basis. If all of the typical peers exit a district so that we have concentrated poverty, concentrated cultural diversity, concentrated language diversity, there aren't typical models of students. If you think about it through a special education lens, the least restrictive environment is very important to ensuring that we provide the same equitable opportunities for all of our students regardless of background. It becomes virtually impossible to do that if there are no, quote, typical peers. In Des Moines, we have worked extremely hard for long before I ever came to the district. So this isn't something I'm trying to toot my own horn on. We've worked very hard to have a variety of choices for our families within the district. And we continue to build on those choices. And we have some nationally renowned programs that our students can take advantage of. In the last 5 years, the years that I need to own as the leader of the district, we have seen a decrease in the number of students applying to open enroll out, and we've seen a significant increase in the number of students who are seeking to open enroll in. But those applications are not tempered in any way by any sort of regulations in regards to student income, cultural background, language background, etc. So one of the things that I think is really important to note and gets at the root of this issue is that 95% of the open enroll out applications that Des Moines Public Schools receives every year are for incoming kindergarten students. I think that's very telling. Once we enroll students into our system, they tend to want to stay in the district, and we feel like we serve them very well. But there is some apprehension with especially first-time parents sending their first child into a school that looks a lot different and sounds a lot different from the school that they experienced growing up. If we allow all of those students, and those students again, as Senator Quirmbach shared, tend to be white and middle-income students, we will be eroding the base of our educational system in Des Moines that serves about 7% of the students, K-12 students, and those effects will be felt vertically through the system very rapidly as time moves on. Another thing that I want to just highlight, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but in regards to the within district transfer process in Des Moines, we really apply that same sort of diversity plan within district transfers too, because we don't want all of our poverty concentrated in particular segments of the city. We draw our boundaries in an attempt to have a robust mix of students at each of our schools, and more of those within district transfer requests would be granted if we had space at all of our buildings. Like all of the other districts in the state, we are trying to run as an efficient an operation as possible, and that means we do not build into our facilities plan excess physical plant that requires a capital investment and ongoing maintenance, utilities, and so forth. So what we're attempting to do is be just right-sized for the students that we're serving, keeping an eye. You know, we always have projections 5 years out, attempting to adjust space where we need it, have the right space in the right place for where our students are located. And so what happens if we don't have any way to moderate or govern the open enrollment in and open enrollment out process, what ends up happening in urban centers like Waterloo and like Cedar Rapids and like Des Moines is that we are reacting to the organic growth of the city, which in Des Moines proper, has tended to be a lot more low-income housing. And we also happen to be the landing spot for virtually all of the refugees coming into our state from countries from around the world. We think that's a wonderful benefit for all of our students to have those students here, but I think it is unfair to those students to keep them all in one space and basically create ghettos where we have immigrants and refugees being served with only immigrants and refugees. It seems like a false promise and not delivering on the promise that was made when we welcomed them into our country. And there's a huge advantage for our students, our native-born students, attending school every day with truly an international population. They're better prepared for college, they're better prepared for the workforce, they have a much more comprehensive understanding of how our world works, what our world looks like, what our world feels like, and are much more adept at adjusting to demographic changes as they progress through their educational and their professional careers. I will push pause there and see where we want to take the conversation.
And so it is our habit that we ask questions, so just raise your hand. I want to note that there is a new bill number, so it was Senate File 270. It is now Senate File 2359. 2359, Senate File. So that is the bill number that you should be working off of as an advocate. So questions? Yes, Pat.
Is the status, the assumption about this particular bill that it's still very much alive? I mean, I got, you know, I pay attention, it's like, oh, this one looks like it's dead for this session, and I don't think so. You know,
Yeah.
what does it look like?
It has survived the first funnel date. It did get out of the Senate Education Committee. We do have some senators that are talking about the priority of parent choice. So we are attending to it as though it has every intention of moving forward until such time as the next funnel proves it hasn't. So.
And what, if a person could only have a one statement to any of these people that look like they're going to vote for this, or they might not, what, each of you, what would you say? What would you have me email or call and say? I see that there's an economic aspect of this that goes beyond their kids. And sometimes, you know, I don't know from my own experience, but people say the Republicans speak business better than they do some other things. So, but just,
Sure.
I think everybody in the room wants that thing.
One nugget. So I do know that in these 3 urban centers with the plans, the school districts have been working with the local business community, and those business folks are weighing in with the Senate Republicans on that, and that helps. So in line of that, to me, there is parent choice now. There is risk of lack of a quality education for the students remaining if we repeal this plan. So the unintended consequence of that outweighs the need to have additional choice since there already is some.
That's what you laid out.
And what I would say, you know, if the motivating factor here is a handful of cases where appeals have been denied that people feel was wrongly decided, we're certainly on the Democratic side more than willing to consider a revision to the appeal process. I mean, I think throwing the diversity plans out entirely is a way overreaction.
Yeah, and I would just suggest that in the first subcommittee meeting on this bill, it was suggested by one of the attendees that the concern was for our disadvantaged students, and I can just tell you that argument doesn't fly because, as Margaret shared earlier, there are virtually no restrictions on low-income families open enrolling out of these districts. That's why the plan is based on the poverty rate, and we we govern it so that as an effect of open enrollment out and in, our poverty rate does not become more disproportionate than it already is. So that argument just doesn't hold any water. So that seems to be some smoke out there blurring people's vision on this bill.
Yeah, in fact, there are a variety of practical reasons to believe that the opposite is true. You know, if you're going to open enroll your kid out, you've got to transport them to the receiving district. You have to have the flexibility in your schedule to take them out, to get them back. You have to be able to afford the transportation. Middle income and higher people with professional jobs, it tends to be a lot easier than folks who have to punch in and punch out at a particular hour. You know, that's in terms of how to deal with the current bill. There's one other aspect to the way to address these problems that would be much better than having people open enroll in or out or whatever. We need to re-engineer the school funding formula to put a weight on kids who come from low-income backgrounds. I tried to do that with a bill a couple of years ago. You know, it was only like $250 per kid, but we've got so many free and reduced lunch kids in this state that would have cost $50 million that, you know, we didn't have back during the recession. You know, we do put additional funding weight on kids with IEPs, all right, kids with various types of disabilities, and also kids with English language learners. So we do address the greater needs associated with certain particular populations. And I think we should do more of that along the lines of kids coming from poverty backgrounds, where the parents are having trouble putting food on the table and keeping a roof over their heads. They don't have money for the educational extras, and maybe the parents themselves aren't all that well educated. They're great kids. They're all great kids, but some of them are going to require a little greater investment of resources to bring them up, to give them a full equal opportunity.
Rick?
Yeah, so I have a comment and a question. First is the comment. Superintendent Aird, I've heard you speak many times about the beauty of the diversity, but I really want to congratulate you on your statements about defending immigrants and boldly standing with immigrants and making them feel safe here, particularly with the DACA debate. So thank you so much. So my question goes to, I think, a critical point you made, that I think you said 95% of these outcalls or the folks that want to leave are happening in kindergarten. So it seems to me that they have a baseless fear because they don't know, it's the unknown. But once they get in the school system, they're content and probably very pleased. So how do we communicate that to folks that there's nothing to fear in the Des Moines school system?
If I didn't know any better, I'd say you were a board member of mine. I don't. That's a good question. I do think that the diversity plan is one of our primary tools to help send that message. For I guess understandable reasons, people crave the familiar, especially when they're trying to nurture their oftentimes their firstborn in our circumstance in Des Moines. And there's also a perception, I believe, that is founded that all schools in Iowa have limited resources, and if we have a preponderance of students, with a 75% poverty rate and over 20% of our students not native English speakers, there are some things that we need to do to appropriately support those students. That a next door district that might be closer to 15% poverty rate and almost all white and almost no language learners, that they don't have to do with virtually the same amount of funding. And so that's something that we're balancing all the time. And I have Cindy Ellsberg, our board vice chair, is here in attendance today, and she's very familiar with these issues. We're constantly trying to weigh how do we appropriately serve these students who are equally deserving of an outstanding education, and provide them the same opportunities when when the cost of doing that is more, and the ability of the families to make some what I call in-kind contributions to their students' education is greatly diminished when compared with some of our neighboring districts. And so the other way, I guess, for us to correct that is what Senator Quirmbach has advocated for many times in the past and continues to push for, is some sort of recognition of something that our state does a beautiful job of, is making sure it's not perfect, but it's closer to perfect than anywhere else in the country. We fund every student exactly the same. What we do a horrible job of is recognizing that every student is not exactly the same, and what a school system has to do to reach that same end goal is dramatically different student to student. And until we start recognizing that, and I can legitimately say that I'm providing the same opportunities that a student could have next door, we'll never quite get there. I think we do a wonderful job of doing that balancing act, but until we recognize that poverty, frankly, is a bigger challenge to us than is English language learners, and that is a growing problem around the state in communities, not just Des Moines, but in some rural and some urban communities across the state. We're going to continue probably to have this same battle, not exclusive to Des Moines.
And can I just finish up one thing here? If I take off my lobbyist hat and put on my parent hat, I've had 4 students that are my children graduate from Hoover High School, one of the most diverse schools in the state. They had amazing opportunities, and so I don't want to leave this group with a perception that the cost of the refugee students, the non-English speaking students, is so exorbitant that the rest of the kids don't have that. There's an international baccalaureate program, there are AP courses, and all kinds of opportunities at Central Campus. And one of the only aviation programs in the nation, and when you add all those things, one of 2, and you add all those things up, any student in Des Moines can find their passion and get an opportunity to prepare them for a successful future.
Regarding the rural districts, Postville and West Liberty, do you feel like that has a lot more to do with educational opportunities, because it's not like, you know, like urban districts as far as educational activities?
There's less open enrollment out in those rural, in those 2 districts in particular. It could be because of the perception of the neighboring school district, but it could be because so many of the students are in poverty in those 2 districts, and because they're rural, it takes more time and more costs to get to the neighbor. So the barrier on the transportation cost may be higher there.
I know this really doesn't directly affect the in and out, because the money doesn't follow the student, hopefully, at least not yet. But what isn't in these statistics is how many people leave for private schools, and I think that's part of the whole perception, because, I mean, in Des Moines with, you know, even non-parochial private schools, there's a choice. So I am thinking, even with Dr.
Boy, it's certainly not Reverend. Oh, God.
Cedar Rapids being kind of a control group. But, you know, I think there's some underlying numbers that could be fed into this from parents who are choosing not to enroll in public education in the first place for some of the very same reasons we're talking about here.
Sure.
The diversity,
Yeah.
poverty.
If you look at that data statewide, we have more students open enrolling out of their district statewide than we have students in private schools, but not by a lot. They're both in the area of around 33, 34,000 on a statewide basis. Of course, your local mileage may vary in terms of percentages, but that is an issue, and there are in all 3 of these urban centers, I would say there are good non-public school choices for those families to choose, and there are investments with state dollars to provide tuition assistance to our lower income families if that would be their choice.
Marty?
I want to testify that my 2 children went to Des Moines Public Schools. One is a PhD graduate from Yale in astrophysics. who
My
manages
condolences.
the Hubble. Not too shabby. And the other one is the communications director at the Ames Lab. So not too shabby. My question is, I can't tell who proposed this bill by looking at it. It says committee bill. And I'm wondering if the people who proposed this bill were from any of
Shelgren.
these 5 districts?
Senate File 270 was filed by Senator Zong.
So he's from
Urbandale, yeah.
So he isn't part of the Des Moines School District. So it's filed by people who don't have any skin in the game.
Other than receiving the
Thank you,
students.
that was my question.
Louisa?
Following up on the national fear question, which I really like that phrase, I see these discussions online all the time with the young parents talking about schools, and they're always talking about test scores. So could you talk about how that influences their decision?
Yes, I would be happy to. In fact, there's another bill that somehow had an overwhelming support in the House last week that I'm still trying to recover from, and we're working the Senate very hard on that at present. But the current assessment situation in Iowa is that we have we have one test that is the public measure for school quality, and that is the Iowa assessments. We know that the Iowa assessments are very poorly aligned with the Iowa core. So even when we have encouraging scores, I'm not encouraged because it's not measuring what it is that we're intending to have happen in our classroom. So that's number one. Number two, and this is borne out for decades with Iowa assessments, there's a very good correlation in proficiency rates on the Iowa assessment scores and poverty rates. And that's particularly true at the elementary level, where in Des Moines, for instance, we have about 1,000 kindergartners every year who, as four-year-olds living in poverty, had no opportunity to attend preschool. So we literally have kindergarten students coming in, the majority of them coming in 2, sometimes 3 or more years behind at kindergarten. When you start measuring them on a standardized test that's designed only to compare students against one another and does not measure growth, it does not tell an accurate picture of school quality. It's a really good measure for what your free and reduced lunch population looks like. And your English language learner population looks like, but it is not a marker for school quality. And when the state was developing its state report card, we pushed back on this considerably because about 70 or 75% of what's included in that report card is tied directly back to the Iowa assessments. And I showed example after example after example of students that came to us, middle school students that came to us new to school, not just in the United States, but new to school, having been born and raised in a refugee camp, didn't know the language, didn't know the culture, didn't know the weather, didn't know school as a concept, and growing. I have many cases I could share with you. Individual students growing, many years progress. Consecutively over 2 or 3 years, but because they didn't hit a certain benchmark by the time they were a sophomore or a junior, they did not even count as a student that had grown. Our current assessment system in the state is an embarrassment for a number of reasons, but first and foremost is because we do not have a test that meets a student where they are. We have the technology to have computer adaptive tests. Why we don't is beyond me. And we also don't have one that's even aligned with the Iowa core curriculum. Until we get that ship righted, we have no business really saying which schools are doing well and which schools are failing, and we certainly don't have a good way to measure what our return on investment is for the extremely large investment that our state currently makes in K-12 education. I would argue that we're getting a lot better deal for those dollars than is the current perception, because we have chosen as a state to not accurately measure the progress that our students are making. So the best way for us to help alleviate the concern that new families naturally have about sending their young child to school is to give them an honest look at how that school is actually performing. If a school has 90% poverty rate, I can tell you, it doesn't matter what district it's in, their proficiency scores at the elementary level are not going to look good. And it does not mean that the school is not doing an outstanding job of serving all students across the spectrum. But we're not measuring that with our current assessment system.
One last question. Did you have?
I think maybe I've answered my own question as I've been thinking about it. How would this affect your budget
The bill that passes will go into effect July 1 this year. You're setting your 19 budget back here in March, but that budget is on this year's numbers, is that correct?
Yes, but
So you
the,
wouldn't necessarily see a derogatory effect for the 2019 year of if you had 200 students that wanted to roll out this summer. You understand?
yes, so the budget count for enrollment is a year in arrears. So this October 1st, we'll count the students, that'll do the budget for the next year. So last October 1, Des Moines Public Schools counted the students that formed the budget for the 18-19 school year. Although it's true that that is the case, if you have growing enrollment, like Des Moines does, that goes on the local property tax base. If you have fewer students, you have what's called a budget guarantee that also goes on the local property tax base. So you may hit that point where there's a shift. And we all know that these three districts, in particular those urban centers, also have low property values supporting each student and higher tax rates than their suburban neighbors in many cases. So not always. The suburban districts have a lot of bond issue debt, so sometimes their tax rate is high too. But you can see the impact in the tax rate before you see the impact in the drop of budget.
With the proposed 1% increase, I think it's 185, correct me if I'm wrong, districts
right.
will be on budget guarantee. So what seems to be the number chosen by the Republican leadership will result in property tax increases in the majority of the districts statewide.
Anything last you want to add, Superintendent?
No, I just, the book that Senator Kornbach recommended earlier, if you're not familiar with it, I strongly recommend it as well. It does get to, I think, the heart of this issue, and if we want Iowa to continue to be a progressive leader as it relates to developing our communities and educating our children, the eradication of the voluntary diversity plans is not going to help, and in fact, it'll accelerate progress in the opposite direction, and it will not be quickly recovered from.
So that was Robert Putnam.
Our
Our
kids.
kids. Okay. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the organizations that are co-sponsors of Moral Mondays. The list is at the bottom of the page. And so thank them also when you talk with those leaders. So see you next week.